They held a board meeting and didn't even invite me. I'm Farah, the one who led the fundraising, coordinated the strategy, and built an entire humanitarian campaign in my father's name for his 65th birthday. I thought if I did the right thing, quietly, thoughtfully, and with love, they'd understand. But I was just in their way. If you've ever been quietly pushed aside by your own family, just when you were trying to do the best for them, I hope you'll stay to the end of this story. It started like any other Tuesday at the Monroe Foundation. The hum of the HVAC system, the scent of industrial-strength coffee from the break room, the muted clicks of keyboards. I was in my office, a modest space compared to some, but it was mine. I was reviewing the latest progress reports from our field partners in West Africa, the ones I'd spent months cultivating for Dad's legacy project. The figures looked promising. The logistics, though complex, were falling into place. A small, quiet smile touched my lips. This was going to be something truly special, something that would honor him in a way that glitter and champagne never could. Around 10 a.m., I noticed the subtle shift. The usual foot traffic past my door thinned. Voices in the hallway became hushed, almost conspiratorial. I didn't think much of it at first. Board meeting days were often like that, a certain level of intensity. But then Sarah, my assistant, a kind woman who usually had a cheerful word, hurried past my open door without her usual nod, her eyes fixed firmly ahead. That was odd. I leaned back in my chair listening. The large conference room, the one reserved for executive board meetings, was down the hall. I couldn't hear distinct voices, just the low murmur that suggested it was occupied. An executive meeting. My mother, Eleanor, was the chair. My brother, Gavin, was a senior board member. And I was a senior financial officer. I usually attended these meetings, especially when significant allocations or new initiatives were discussed. The West Africa project certainly qualified. An hour passed. Then another. The silence from my phone, the absence of an email summons, started to feel heavy. I checked my calendar again. Nothing. No meeting invite. No oversight on my part. I walked to the coffee machine, a manufactured errand. The door to the executive conference room was closed. No sound escaped. It was as if a vacuum seal had been placed around it, keeping the important business in and, me out. I returned to my desk, the coffee suddenly tasting bitter. Confusion was the first wave. A simple mistake, perhaps? An oversight. With my mother, oversights were rare. She was meticulous, especially when it came to asserting her control. Hurt followed, a dull ache starting in my chest. I'd poured my soul into this foundation, into this specific project for Dad. I'd worked late nights, early mornings, navigated complex international regulations, all while maintaining my usual duties. To be excluded, it felt like a deliberate erasure. Lunchtime came and went. The meeting, I presumed, had adjourned. Still no one came by. No email. No call. My mother walked past my office, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. She glanced in, a brief, unreadable look, and then continued on. Gavin didn't even look my way. It was the silence that was the loudest. The deliberate, deafening silence that offered no explanation, because apparently none was deemed necessary. I sat there in the quiet of my office, the hum of the computer a mocking counterpoint to the turmoil inside me. The room without my name on the attendee list. The decisions made without my voice. And the slow dawning realization that this wasn't an accident. This was a statement. The idea for the West Africa project. It wasn't born in a boardroom. It was born in the hushed quiet of a hospital room 2 years ago. My father, Gregory, had suffered a minor stroke. Minor, they called it. But seeing him there in that sterile bed, his usually strong hands trembling slightly as he reached for a glass of water, it wasn't minor to me. He'd always been my anchor, the quiet, thoughtful presence in a family that often felt loud and driven by agendas I didn't always understand. My mother, Eleanor, was a force of nature, all ambition and perfectly curated appearances. My older brother, Gavin, mirrored her in many ways, polished and pragmatic, always seeming to know which way the wind was blowing. I was different. More like Dad, I suppose. Quieter. More observant. During those weeks of his recovery, I was there. Day and night. I learned the rhythms of the hospital, the beeps of the machines, the hushed conversations of the night staff. I read to him mostly poetry, the lines of which seemed to hang in the air, filled with unspoken things. He didn't talk much at first, but his eyes, they followed me, and in them I saw a vulnerability I'd never witnessed before, and a deep, abiding trust that humbled me. My mother would visit, of course. She'd sweep in, all brisk efficiency and perfectly modulated concern, discuss treatment plans with doctors in a way that left no room for their actual opinions, and then sweep out again, citing urgent foundation business. Gavin would call, his voice full of the right kind of sympathy, but always with one ear on his next conference call. It was during one quiet afternoon, the sunlight slanting through the window, dust motes dancing in the beam, that Dad spoke about his youth. He hadn't talked about it for years. He told me about the 2 years he'd spent as a young man, a missionary in a small village in West Africa. Long before the foundation, long before the wealth and the boardrooms. He spoke of the people, their resilience, their warmth, the challenges they faced, the simple dignities they fought for. His voice was soft, tinged with a nostalgia that was almost painful to hear. He'd always wanted to go back, he said, to do more. But life had taken other turns. And right there, holding his hand, the scent of antiseptic faint in the air, a promise formed in my heart. Not a spoken one, but a deep silent vow. I would do something meaningful, something that would honor that part of him, the part that yearned for connection and purpose beyond balance sheets and donor galas. That's when the seed of the West Africa Project was planted, a humanitarian initiative focused on education and sustainable development in the very region he'd spoken of. It would be his legacy, yes, but more than that, it would be a testament to the man he truly was, beneath the layers of expectation and family politics. It was a promise made in silence, fueled by love and a fierce, quiet determination. I truly thought it was something everyone in the family would embrace. How wrong I was. The months that followed Dad's recovery were a blur of quiet, focused work on my part. I dove into the research for the West Africa Project, identifying potential partner organizations, outlining a strategic plan, crunching the numbers to ensure its feasibility. I did this mostly on my own time, evenings, weekends. During work hours, I kept up with my duties as senior financial officer, ensuring the Monroe Foundation ran smoothly. I didn't make a grand announcement about the project. That wasn't my style. I believed, perhaps naively, that its merit would speak for itself, that when the time was right, my family would see the heart behind it, especially Dad. But while I was building bridges to West Africa, my mother and Gavin were building something else entirely, walls. Smiling walls perhaps, but walls nonetheless. They started planning Dad's 65th birthday celebration, and it was grand. A gala, they called it. A huge public spectacle designed to showcase the foundation's generosity, and by extension, their leadership. I first heard whispers of it from Rebecca, Gavin's wife. She's a gentle soul, Rebecca, always trying to keep the peace, often caught in the crossfire. She mentioned it casually one day. "Eleanor's so excited about the gala. Have you heard the guest list?" I hadn't. No one had spoken to me about a gala. "Oh," I'd said, trying to keep my voice light. "Sounds ambitious." "Ambitious is Eleanor's middle name," Rebecca had replied with a small, nervous laugh. And then a little too quickly she changed the subject. That was the first flicker of unease. Small things started to add up. My mother, who usually consulted me on any significant expenditure, was suddenly having closed-door meetings with event planners, caterers, Gavin, who'd often bounce strategic ideas off me, even if he rarely took my advice, became distant, almost evasive. When I tried to bring up the West Africa project to share my progress, they were always busy. Later, Farah, my mother would say, a dismissive wave of her hand, "We're swamped with the gala preparations right now." Or Gavin would interrupt, "Fascinating, Farah, but we really need to focus on the Q4 fundraising targets for the gala. That's the priority." The gala. It became this all-consuming entity, overshadowing everything. And the more I learned about it, the more it felt wrong. It was flashy, expensive, all about optics. It wasn't about Dad, not really. Not the Dad I knew, the one who valued quiet contribution over public adulation. My project, the one I was pouring my heart into for him, felt increasingly small, invisible, in the glare of their grand production. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that the work itself was what counted. But the exclusion stung. It was subtle, insidious. Polite smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. Doors that were, quite literally, closed to me. I'd catch my mother and Gavin in intense, hushed discussions in her office, the door slightly ajar, and it would click shut the moment they sensed my presence. The foundation, which was supposed to be about community and support, started to feel like a place of carefully constructed barriers with me on the outside. I kept working on my project, though, stubbornly, quietly, believing that truth and genuine effort would eventually shine through. I was still holding on to that belief that silent sacrifice would be seen. It was a belief that was about to be severely tested. The donor planning meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning. This wasn't for the gala. This was supposed to be about the Foundation's core philanthropic initiatives for the coming year. My West Africa project was, or should have been, a key part of that discussion. I'd prepared a concise, compelling presentation. I had the data, the projections, the human stories. I felt cautiously optimistic. Perhaps this was where I could finally integrate my work into the broader vision, get their official blessing, the resources needed to truly launch. I arrived a few minutes early, my presentation materials tucked under my arm. The smaller conference room, the one typically used for these strategic sessions, was already filling up. Board members, key donors, my mother at the head of the table, Gavin to her right. I scanned the room for an empty seat, a name card. There were name cards at each place, elegant, calligraphed. And as my eyes moved around the table, a cold knot formed in my stomach. My name wasn't there. Not at the main table. Not at the smaller side table usually reserved for support staff, though even those seats were assigned. I stood there for a moment, just inside the doorway, feeling the warmth drain from my face. People were chatting, sipping coffee, oblivious to the invisible wall I'd just run into. My mother looked up, saw me. Her expression didn't change. No surprise. No flicker of apology for an oversight. Just a calm, appraising look. "Farah," she said, her voice perfectly modulated, carrying easily across the room. "Good morning. We weren't expecting you at this particular session." My voice felt trapped in my throat. I thought this was the strategic planning meeting for new initiatives. The West Africa project. She smiled, a thin, knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ah yes, your project." She exchanged a brief glance with Gavin, who offered a tight, equally unreadable smile. "Farah dear," my mother continued, her tone now laced with a kind of patronizing sympathy that was worse than outright hostility. "We appreciate your enthusiasm. Truly. But these high-level donor discussions, they require a certain detachment, a strategic mindset. You tend to get, shall we say, a little too emotionally invested. Too emotional for leadership." The words hung in the air, a public indictment, delivered so calmly, so reasonably, as if it were an established fact, a kind, gentle truth I simply needed to accept. I looked around the room. A few sympathetic glances from people who knew my work, quickly averted. Most just looked uncomfortable, eager for the awkward moment to pass. Gavin studied some papers in front of him, pointedly avoiding my gaze. My presentation felt like a lead weight under my arm. The passion, the meticulous planning, the late nights, all dismissed with a casual cutting remark. I wasn't unqualified. I wasn't unprepared. I was simply inconvenient. My vision for the foundation for Dad's legacy didn't align with theirs. And so I was to be managed, sidelined, made to feel small. I didn't say anything. What could I say? Arguing would only prove her point, make me look emotional. I just nodded, a single stiff movement. I see, I managed, my voice barely a whisper. I turned and walked out, the silence of the room pressing against my back. Each step down the hallway felt heavy, the polished floor cold beneath my feet. Devastation was a tidal wave, threatening to pull me under. But beneath it, something else was stirring. A tiny heart spark, injustice, and a dawning unwelcome clarity. They weren't just overlooking me. They were actively working to erase me. And that I realized was something I couldn't just quietly accept anymore. A seat that wasn't mine. Perhaps it was time to find out where my true place was. I went back to my office, closed the door, and for a long time I just sat there staring at the wall. The casual cruelty of my mother's words echoed. Too emotional for leadership. Was that what they truly thought? Or was it just a convenient excuse to exclude me from their carefully orchestrated plans? The meticulous work I'd done on the West Africa project, the detailed financial modeling, the strategic partnerships I'd forged, none of that was emotional. It was professional. It was dedicated. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear anger. But not the kind that makes you shout. The kind that makes you think. I pulled up the files for the West Africa project on my screen. All those months of work. I made a decision. I canceled my upcoming travel to meet with the field partners. I put the entire campaign on hold. If they didn't want my contribution, if they didn't value my expertise, then they wouldn't have it. Let them plan their flashy gala. Let them manage their optics. But then a memory surfaced. Something I hadn't thought about in years. It was from long ago, when Dad first established the Monroe Foundation. He'd been so idealistic then, so full of hope for what it could achieve. He'd involved me even then, though I was much younger. He'd talked to me about his vision, about governance, about safeguards. And there was one particular detail. A legally binding trustee clause. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the Foundation's digital archives, a place I knew better than almost anyone. My fingers flew across the keyboard, searching through old incorporation documents, minutes from early board meetings, trust agreements. And then I found it, tucked away in a lengthy, dense legal document from the Foundation's inception. A clause Dad himself had insisted upon, drafted by his personal lawyer, not the Foundation's corporate counsel. It stated in clear, unambiguous language that any project or initiative bearing his name, or publicly dedicated to him, required his personal written consent, and this was the crucial part. It also stipulated that I, Farrah Monroe, as a designated trustee for such personal legacy matters, held final review and approval rights over the use of his name and likeness in connection with any new major philanthropic endeavor. My breath caught. They'd forgotten. Or perhaps my mother and Gavin had never known. Or maybe they knew and simply assumed I'd forgotten, or that I wouldn't have the nerve to invoke it. It was a relic from a time when Dad's vision was purer, before my mother's influence had become so pervasive, before Gavin had learned to navigate the currents of power so adeptly. This clause, it wasn't about money or control in the way they understood it. It was about integrity. His integrity. And as it turned out, it gave me a voice they couldn't silence. A slow smile spread across my face. Not a triumphant one, but a smile of quiet understanding. They thought I was too emotional. They thought I was weak, easily dismissed. What they didn't know was that my quietness wasn't weakness. It was observation. My emotion wasn't a flaw. It was the source of my dedication, and I had something they hadn't counted on. A piece of paper, a legally binding promise that could change everything. I didn't know yet how I would use it, but the despair that had threatened to consume me began to lift, replaced by a sense of quiet empowerment. A plan wasn't fully formed, but the pieces were beginning to shift into place. They might have taken my seat at their table, but they didn't know I held a key to the entire room. The call came late one evening, about a week after the donor meeting. I was at home, curled up with a book, trying to find some semblance of peace amidst the quiet storm brewing within me. The caller ID showed Gavin's number. I hesitated. I hadn't spoken to him, not really, since that day. A few perfunctory emails about routine foundation business, nothing more. I let it ring a few times, then answered. Farah. His voice was strained, not his usual smooth, confident tone. Gavin. What's up? I kept my voice neutral. A pause. I could hear him take a breath. Can we talk? Off the record? Off the record. That was a new one. About everything. Mom. The gala. Your project. My heart rate quickened. I'm listening. He sounded different. Agitated. Almost guilty. He started to talk, haltingly at first, then the words tumbled out, a torrent of confession. He told me that Mom had been planning to sideline me for months, that she saw my West Africa project not as a tribute to Dad, but as a threat to her own control over the foundation's narrative and its funds. She wanted the spotlight for herself, for her version of philanthropy, the high-profile, big donation-generating kind. My quieter, more grassroots approach was, in her eyes, sentimental and inefficient. She convinced me it was for the best, Gavin said, his voice low. That you were too close to it, Farah. That your judgment was clouded. That the gala was what Dad really wanted for his birthday, something big, something everyone would talk about. And you believed her? I asked the question flat, devoid of the accusation I felt. I wanted to, he admitted, and there was a rawness in his voice I hadn't heard since we were kids. It was easier. You know how she can be. She paints a picture and you start to believe it. Then came the part that made the floor drop out from under me. The thing is, Farah, Dad doesn't even know about your West Africa project. Not really. Not the specifics. Mom, she told him you were working on some small preliminary research, nothing concrete. She never told him the extent of it, how much work you'd done, how much it meant to you or to him. Silence. The mirror didn't just crack. It shattered. All this time I'd assumed Dad knew. I'd thought perhaps he was quietly supporting me from the sidelines, or maybe he was being swayed by Mom and Gavin, but that fundamentally he understood. To learn that he was completely in the dark, that was a different kind of betrayal. My mother hadn't just lied to me. She had actively deceived my father, manipulating his perception of his own daughter. She had isolated me, not just from the foundation's power structure, but from him. She told him you were struggling a bit, Gavin continued, his voice barely a whisper now, that you were overwhelmed, and that the gala was something she and I were handling to take the pressure off everyone, especially him, so he could just enjoy his birthday. Overwhelmed. Struggling. The narrative she'd spun was so complete, so devious. I felt a wave of nausea. The hurt was profound, deeper than anything I'd felt before. It wasn't just about a project anymore, or a seat at a table. It was about truth. It was about the deliberate corrosion of trust, the manipulation of love. Gavin was still talking, something about how things had gotten out of hand, how he hadn't realized how far Mom would take it. I barely heard him. Why are you telling me this now, Gavin? I finally asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Another pause. Because it's wrong, Farah. And because Dad, he asked me about you today. He said you seemed distant. He asked if you were okay. And I couldn't lie to him. Not about that. A seed of something, not justice, not yet, but a desperate need for truth began to sprout in the desolate landscape of my heart. Gavin's confession, motivated by whatever mix of guilt or belated conscience, had given me the one thing I needed most: confirmation. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't too emotional. I had been systematically, deliberately, and cruelly undermined. And my father had been kept in the dark, a pawn in my mother's game. The heartbreak was raw, but through it, a path began to clear. The next morning I called Gavin. "We need to talk to Dad," I said, no preamble. "Together. You and me. And we need to tell him everything." There was a moment of silence on his end. I could almost hear the calculations, the fear. But then he surprised me. "Okay, Farah. Okay. When?" "Tonight," I said. "At his house. Just the three of us." Dad lived in the old family home, a quiet, comfortable place filled with books and memories. It was where I always felt most at peace, most myself. When Gavin and I arrived, Dad greeted us with his usual gentle smile, but his eyes were searching, concerned. He knew something was amiss. My mother was conveniently out for the evening, a prior engagement she couldn't possibly break, one I suspected Gavin might have subtly encouraged. We sat in his study, the room smelling of old leather and lemon polish. For a moment no one spoke. Then I looked at Gavin. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. It was my story to tell, but his presence there, his willingness to corroborate, was crucial. So I began. I started with the promise I'd made to myself in the hospital, the dream of the West Africa Project, a tribute to his early years, his deepest values. I laid out the months of work, the research, the partnerships, the strategic plan. I spoke calmly, factually, letting the passion for the project itself shine through, rather than any personal grievance. Then I told him about the exclusion, the board meeting I wasn't invited to, the donor meeting where there was no seat for me. I recounted Mom's words, "Too emotional for leadership." I saw a flicker of something in Dad's eyes, confusion, then a dawning pain. Gavin picked up the thread then. He confessed his own complicity, his voice quiet, ashamed. He told Dad how Mom had orchestrated it all, how she had downplayed my project to him, painting me as overwhelmed and in need of their help with the gala. He told Dad that she had never intended for the West Africa Project to see the light of day, because it didn't fit her agenda. As we spoke, Dad listened intently. His gaze shifted between me and Gavin. The initial shock on his face slowly hardened into a deep, profound sorrow, and then an undeniable anger. Not a loud anger, but a quiet, steely resolve that I recognized. It was the same resolve I'd seen in him when he faced down corporate raiders years ago, the same quiet strength that had always been his hallmark. When we finished, there was a long silence. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Dad looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own, but also with a dawning understanding, and a fierce protective love that wrapped around me like a shield. She told me you were happy to let them handle the birthday celebrations," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That you wanted to focus on your smaller research tasks." I just shook my head, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm, unwavering. "Farah," he said, his voice clear now, all traces of confusion gone. "I am so sorry. So incredibly sorry that I didn't see. That I didn't ask more questions." He then looked at Gavin. "And you, son, you have a lot to answer for. But telling the truth now, that was the right thing to do. The first right thing, it seems, in a long time." Gavin just nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. Dad stood up. This deception stops now." He walked over to his desk, picked up the phone. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting. Tomorrow morning. Everyone will be there." Relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. Not relief that there would be a confrontation, but relief that the truth was finally out. That my father knew. That he saw me, truly saw me. The bond between us, stretched and strained by unseen manipulations, felt suddenly, powerfully reconnected. The emergency board meeting was held in the main conference room, the same room from which I'd been excluded just weeks before. This time, however, there was a seat for me, right beside my father at the head of the table. My mother, Eleanor, sat opposite, her composure immaculate, but I could see the tightness around her eyes, the slight tremor in her perfectly manicured hands as she arranged her papers. Gavin sat a few seats down, looking pale but resolute. The other board members looked curious, tense. They knew something significant was about to happen. Dad opened the meeting. His voice was calm, measured, but with an undercurrent of iron. He didn't go into accusations. He simply stated that he had new information regarding the Foundation's recent activities and a proposed legacy project that had been, in his words, grievously mishandled. Then he turned to me. "Farah, please." I didn't stand. I didn't raise my voice. I simply spoke. I laid out the history of the West Africa project, my vision, the work I'd done. And then I presented the evidence. Not with anger but with clarity. I had compiled a concise dossier, emails showing my project updates to my mother and Gavin, and their dismissive or evasive replies. Financial projections for the project, demonstrating its viability and impact, starkly contrasted with the exorbitant budget for the gala. I even had a copy of the seating chart from the donor meeting where my name was conspicuously absent. And finally, I had printouts of the visitor logs from my father's hospital stay, showing my near-constant presence, juxtaposed with the far more sporadic visits from my mother and brother. I didn't have audio clips or photos of secret meetings, but the paper trail, the documented pattern of exclusion and misinformation, was damning enough. It painted a clear picture of quiet, systematic betrayal. As I spoke, a profound silence fell over the room. My mother's face was a mask, but a few telltale spots of color rose on her neck. Gavin kept his eyes down. When I finished, I looked at my father. He nodded slowly. Then he addressed the board, his voice ringing with an authority they hadn't heard in years. He spoke of the founding principles of the Monroe Foundation: integrity, transparency, genuine impact. He spoke of his personal dismay and profound disappointment at the manipulation and deceit that had occurred under his own roof, within his own family. And then he made his decision. He announced that Eleanor Monroe was being immediately removed from her role as chair of the board and all executive duties related to the foundation. A gasp went around the table. My mother's composure finally cracked. Her face went white. "Gregory, you can't," she began, her voice sharp. "I can, Eleanor." "And I have," he stated, his gaze unwavering. "The foundation will undergo a full governance review. And the West Africa project," he continued, turning to me, a rare, soft smile gracing his lips, "will go forward. Immediately. Under Farah's direct leadership, with my full support and involvement. This won't be a foundation project in name only. This will be our project, Farah. Just as it should have been from the start." He didn't need to invoke the trustee clause I had discovered. His moral authority, awakened and asserted, was enough. The truth, presented simply and without rancor, had been more powerful than any shouting match or boardroom battle. It was a quiet justice, but it resonated deeply. My dignity, so carefully chipped away, felt restored. Not through revenge, but through the simple, undeniable power of truth, and the unwavering touch of a father's love finally seen clearly. The West Africa project would proceed, not as a monument to ego, but as a genuine expression of care, a legacy reclaimed. Sometimes you're excluded not because you weren't good enough, but because you were too good for the game they were playing. Truth doesn't need to shout. If you keep moving with quiet clarity, it always finds a way back. It wasn't about winning, not really. It was about reclaiming what was true, what was real. My relationship with my mother and brother. That's a different story, one that's still unfolding slowly, with much healing yet to do. But my bond with my father, that's stronger than ever. We're working on the West Africa project together side by side. And it's everything I dreamed it would be. More even. Because now it's built not on silent sacrifice, but on shared understanding. If you've ever been left out of something important, just because you didn't fit their version of success, tell me your story in the comments. I read everyone. And if you've ever given your heart to people who forgot you the moment the spotlight turned, I hope this story reminds you of your power, your quiet, steady power. Leave a comment, subscribe to TK Revenge Story for more stories of quiet strength, or support us via super thanks, because sometimes telling our stories and hearing others is how we heal. Thank you for listening.